Hi, everybody. Welcome to Screen Less, Play More, the podcast. I am Cynthia, the founder of ScreenLessPlayMore.com. And in the last few episodes, we've been talking a lot about the doom and gloom of the screen less part of this equation. But now, today, we get to talk about the play more part of it. And I am so excited to introduce you guys to Sally Swiatek. I am just so excited. She is the founder and director of an authentically play-based preschool called The Little Patch of Earth in Santa Clarita, California. She has degrees in early childhood education and human development, and she is an avid volunteer in youth service organizations. And she is the woman that got me interested in all of this. I was just a new mom trying to figure out, oh, my son's 3. I guess I sign him up for preschool. I guess that's what we do. And I toured a few of the regular preschools that have bright colored posters on the walls. And now it's story time. Now it's craft time. Now it's playtime with blocks. And then I went and toured the Little Patch of Earth, and it was a revelation. So Sally was the director of my children's preschool that we went to. And so, Sally, can you just actually tell everyone, like, if we were to walk into the patch, what would we see? And what were all the different, like, choices that kids had of fun things to do?
Oh, hi, Cynthia. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, when you would walk in, you would see probably a 1 acre of outdoor space that had a couple of classrooms on the peripheral land of the 1 acre, and that it was just, I would say it was aesthetically beautiful. Some people would say that there was, chaos and mess, and I just considered that beautiful.
I would say magical. I always thought it was very magical.
Yeah, I thought so too. And then once you added the kids to it, and you could hear the joy and the laughter and the awe from, ladybugs to, the rain that they were allowed to play in, and the puddles that would collect and they would, splash with glee. And it wasn't for everyone. So we required that in order before you even applied, you had to attend a 1-hour tour. And so that we could really sit down and discuss the values and the philosophy of the program. And I find that those words, the values and philosophy, are just so important at that stage of family work. Because so often, we find our partners, we start a family, and, we're just on that trajectory of status quo, right? Like, what is everybody else doing? Mm-hmm. Without doing a lot of that really deep internal work about what it is that we value and what our philosophy is, and to kind of cement it in some way in our family work so that we are always reflecting back on it. So some families, would hear of the popularity of the program and think that it was for them. And then when they really went with some of their values, they realized they didn't want their kids to get dirty, or they wanted to know where the learning was happening if all they were doing was play. And so they were nervous. And, but then there were those families that really, trusted us. That was another really big word in my career, was trust. Families had to trust us. We had to trust children. I had to trust my staff to really align those values so that we were creating a really meaningful program for children.
The first time I walked in there, it just was so different than anything I had seen. It was different than my preschool, but like I said, it was really just so magical. It had a mud pit. It had chickens. It had a tortoise named Benny. My sister loved that. Every time my sister would talk to my son, she would be like, how was preschool today? How was Benny? So he's the enormous tortoise, older than my 80-year-old mother. He's probably going to outlive us all, but he would just meander around the grounds, and the kids were like so happy to just say hi to him or play with him or feed him. I mean, there was like a rope for swinging. There was a garden. There was, a lot of times there was just one of the teachers walking around playing a guitar for the kids, and like the Pied Piper, the kids would just follow him around as he played the guitar. One thing I thought was so cool was like there was a construction area where kids really did construction. They used real hammers, they used real saws, they used real nails, and it was just so cool. And so why was it important to you that the patch be mostly outside?
Well, there's a lot of properties that we know, right, that nature has. It's beautiful, it's aesthetically pleasing. It also liberated children when young children in particular are learning to leave their most trusted source at home. When you take them into another classroom with four walls, it can be very stifling and frightening. But when a child was let, into the yard and still had to say goodbye, to their trusted source, there were so many opportunities for them to gravitate to. Some kids would go to the swing and they would just sit on the swing at drop off every single morning. And the parents would like call us and be like, do they ever get off that swing? And we would be like, yes, there's so much work happening right there, right? They are watching the rules of engagement. They're studying the world in front of them while they're safely on that swing doing something. And you can't do that in a small like classroom. Also, children are just sensory awaking. They're awaking their senses. And sometimes a classroom can be very noisy. It could be almost too much stimuli. And then also an outdoor playscape offers totally different sensory experiences. The mud pit is a very intentional thing for me to put there. The sandbar had a water fountain at the top, and it had pebble tech, pathway, but big boulders, because we wanted kids to have different textures underneath their feet. They were allowed to be barefoot. So there was dirt, there was grass, there was boulders, there was stone, there were, crunchy leaves. So these were big sensory experiences that we knew was really important to development. And also it, just liberated kids, I think, to know that they had so many choices of places to go. What we would do as deep observers of how children use time and space and materials, we would start to see something track with a student, which really told us how their brain was lighting up. Mm-hmm. And then we knew how to create provocations to keep sustaining that interest in them. So the curriculum was very fluid and very flexible all of the time because we were trying to create representations of their interest.
Yeah. It was just so, I think, so freeing for the kids. And, your phrase was, there's no such thing as bad weather, only the wrong clothing, the bad clothing. And so one thing I think that was so funny that was so different than most places is we needed to bring 3 changes of clothes. And God bless your teachers, because they must have spent most of their day changing children out of muddy clothes and wet clothes.
They did. Yeah.
But, it is just such a fun, different, I'd say it's a different way of learning, but it's really the way we've learned for centuries is through play and through experimentation and through the senses and through nature. Sure. And so they were allowed to be outside when it was rainy. They were allowed to splash in mud puddles and huge rain puddles. And I just remember showing up and there'd be like big puddles and they'd have like a boat in the puddle that they were making. And they just absolutely loved it.
Inflatable raft. Yeah.
Oh man. And like you said, it was also important that they could go barefoot. They could go topless if they wanted. I mean, it was just, very, very led by what the kids wanted and needed. And I also appreciated that on the indoor days, every once in a while, like it was maybe incredibly windy or, just, it was in California, so there weren't that many bad weather days. But if kids were inside, I appreciated too that they were either inside a large space and just running around and playing and having fun. Or maybe like one time I remember picking up and there was like one of those kind of old school 70s, 80s overhead projectors. And the kids were just drawing something on the transparency and then they would explain their story to the rest of the kids. There was no TV. It was not like, oh, we're indoors today, let's all watch 5 movies in a row. It's like, no, we're indoors, but we're still going to kind of keep the same philosophy going, whether we're indoors or outdoors. And I see this a lot because we still have a sweatshirt from the Little Patch of Earth, and it says, where play is all the learning we need. And I think that just says so much. And I'm just wondering if you can explain to people, for some people, this is kind of a new concept. Why is it so important that children play?
Yeah. Well, play really plays a significant role in building communication and social skills. So when you look at preschool and what the foundations of preschool are, it first and foremost, it is really about building communication and social skills. It provides opportunities for creativity and problem solving. It is vital to the development of empathy and social altruism, to handle the stress of emerging relationships. And kids, I used to sit on the board of the California Kindergarten Association, and, we would assess teachers, kindergarten teachers in the state of California. What is it that you really want children to be prepared for upon arrival in kindergarten? And what they wanted, they did not want kids to be pre-readers. They did not want them to know 100 sight words or to count to 20 or to 100. What they wanted were that kids had a sense of identity, that they had autonomy, that they knew how to help themselves or to stand and say, I need help tying my shoe. I would like to go to the bathroom now. I don't like that he keeps poking me. I don't want to share this right now. Because what that does is, it helps the teacher, not have, we had one teacher for every 5 children, at the Patch, because it was so play-based that we knew that there was a lot of risk management that was happening. And in order to manage the risk, that was very important for children to experience, we had to have a lot of staff. And then when they go into kindergarten, there's like one teacher and maybe an aide to like 24 kids. So you can imagine if all of these kids are dysregulated, you're really not ready to learn. You can't sit down and process any information if you don't have the skills of knowing how to manage your social dynamic. And so that kind of regulation comes strictly through play. It builds purpose. It builds agency. There's so much joy and wonder. It creates flexibility and innovation. And here is the rub with play. We know that it is the foundation for learning, but it is built on experiences that come naturally. That's where play has the greatest benefit. So it has to be freely chosen by the child. It has to be directed by the child, intrinsically motivated by the child. It has to have no adult agenda. That's the kind of play that really pays all of those dividends of self-regulation and being able to express ideas and feelings, being creative, having that sense of innovation. And unfortunately, a lot of that kind of play is undermined by the culture that we're in today of structured activities, adult agendas, people policing children's play, the lack of free time, and most of all, the forcing of early academics on children.
Mm-hmm.
So what we saw was that the education had to come from what really is play, right? It's a very complex thing. We have tons of theorists out there, from Bob Hughes to Peter Gray to the early theorists of Vygotsky and Mildred Parton. And, everybody has their theory about what play is, but all of them say exactly the same thing. That one thread that is in common is that it has to be motivated by the child in those really early developmental years, which is birth through age 8. And that's what the patch, set out to create, was a really authentically play-based program. And it wasn't easy because you're kind of going against the grain,
Yeah. Yeah. I just remember one thing that you mentioned, maybe even at the orientation, in terms of getting kids ready. You're saying, this age and this stage was when they discovered so many different things and textures and situations. And your example was, this is the place and this is the time where they can pour out the entire bottle of glue on the piece of paper and touch it and see what it's like and figure it out. And then it's out of their system. And then they can go to kindergarten and see a bottle of glue and be like, oh, I know what that's all about. I don't need to pour it out and
That's right.
get the teacher annoyed.
Right.
And, there's...
And that the teacher's directive in kindergarten would be a dot is a lot. But like a child's brain who's never gotten to experience the principles of glue are saying, wait a minute, a dot is not a lot. Like, I need to feel it and touch it and taste it and let it dry and peel it off my fingers. And now I'm understanding, oh, you're showing me something else this glue can do. Mm-hmm. So that's why you're more geared to follow a directive later if you've had all of those open-ended experiences in their really early years.
Yeah. Well, and then, I think American parents especially have a hard time comprehending that kids are, in fact, learning as they're playing. And I remember there was an app that you guys used at the Patch called Bright Wheel, and you would send pictures to parents. Oh, he's on the slide, he's on the... on the rope swing or whatever. And there would be these little tags that you could add that would say whatever skill they were learning by doing that thing. It might say empathy or balance or hand-eye coordination. But I sort of think that was you guys' way of giving training wheels to the parents.
Yes,
who are
because
they're just playing.
That's right. There's that trust word again. So we knew that in order for parents to really trust that their kids were having these broad experiences where it just looked crazy, messy play, that we knew embedded in all of that were all of these beautiful developmental domains that were emerging. So we knew that we had to be developmentalists. We had to be able to capture how a child was using of space or a material or the way they were in a relationship. And we would then apply it to an area of development so that the parents could relax a little. And to be really honest, in our profession as early childhood educators, there's some debate about, and I hope I'm not offending anyone, but there is some kind of resentment sometimes that an educator has when they have to spend so much time proving to others that learning is alive and well and happening. Because, a lot of those teachers, and I can tell you, we had 20 teachers, and they are by far some of the most amazing humans I have ever met, because they were not compensated for that time, where they were writing developmental summaries, where they were uploading their photographs and tagging the developmental domains. And they did that because of their deep passion for the rights that these children had to use time and space and materials the way their bodies and brains needed them to. And what we had to do is to spend all of this extra time proving it to the parents, so that they could trust that experience. And lots of people got it, right? You were one, you just were always so available and in awe and supportive. And then we would get parents who, after a year of the Patch, would put them in another preschool because they would say, thanks for that play, but now it's time for them to learn. And then they would put them in an academic, like, preschool. And that would just like tear us apart, because then we would feel like maybe we're just not doing our job well enough, to really show where the learning was happening.
Right.
So that was always a challenge,
Yeah. Well, I mean, as an example, these kids, obviously, they're eventually going to be going to kindergarten and they need to learn how to write. But I just thought it was so fascinating that you guys would prepare them in a different way than we see a lot in modern day preschools, where their hands, their eyes, their bodies, their coordination needs to be prepared, but you guys didn't do it through pencils and worksheets. Could you explain some of the different methods you guys would use to get them prepared for things like holding a pencil?
So we knew that it's important, right? It's important that kids, grow in interest and a connection to the fact that letters are symbols for words, and words are a means of expressing ideas and feelings and all of that. So we know. But again, that trust word has to come in to play, because we trusted that if you provided the opportunities in multiple environments, that when the child was really ready, they would. So, and like our sensory table would always have clay. That was like, and sometimes we would make the clay. Sometimes we would purchase like different types of clay. Bread making was a really big part. That was all about, sure, it was a sensory experience. It was fun. There were all kinds of different materials that they could integrate with clay play, but it was really about strengthening those fine motor skills that we knew, supported the pincer grasp and the, holding the pencil. So you can't ask a child to suddenly, write a letter. To write a letter of the alphabet when they don't have the muscles in their hands. So we knew that. And there was tons of opportunity for them to do that. There were always clipboards where we would go up to children and we would say, how does your story start? And in the beginning, they would be like, I don't have a story. And if you kept asking them, then they would start to feel empowered to say, I do have a story. And then they would start to tell us, and then we would write it verbatim on a piece of paper, and they would watch us. And then we would say, what would you like us to do with it? And they would say, oh, I want to bring it home to my mom or my dad. And then we would fold it and they would put it in their like cubby. So they would start to see like, oh, those letters that we were, forming ourselves were actually symbols for print. And that then starts to awaken them. We always created provocations, that balancing the boulders, we used to do those, I don't know if you remember the obstacle courses. We would make these really big elaborate obstacle courses where they were always using right and left hands, crossing the midline, I think we call it, so that they could learn dominance. Because when kids don't have those opportunities, they kind of ambidextrous is really not favorable to writing. You do want to have a dominant hand. So those were some of the reasons why, we had so much writing and literacy development. There was always story time, but story times were always about engaging them first through oral storytelling. So we always read books throughout the day, but our morning circle was always oral storytelling, because there is so much that comes from kids being able to see the live animation of a story come to work, and they would supply the sound and the special effects of a story. That's literacy development. You're grabbing their interest that, that everybody has a story to tell. The most important thing I think that the patch did was really to tell children that we trusted that they had ideas. And, our provocations were always, do you have enough? What is your idea? What's happening here? Do you need more? And in the beginning, they didn't always understand why we were asking them that. And by the end of the year, they would get out of the car in the parking lot, and if they would see us, they would be like, hey, I got an idea today. So they were already spinning those ideas in the car on the way to school, knowing and preparing themselves for the question that we would ask, what is your idea today? Like, how powerful must that be for a child, you know?
Yeah.
Oh.
I just love all these different ways to just get everybody ready, get their brains ready, but in just such creative ways. I remember showing up one day and my son was wearing a helmet that had a paintbrush sticking out of it. And he was painting on kind of like a huge piece of butcher paper, like doing a mural basically with his head. And I just thought,
Yeah.
just think of all the like neurons that are firing and the different coordination that takes to draw with your head instead of draw with your hands. It's just,
and the absolute joy of it. And that is Siobhan.
Yeah.
That was teacher Siobhan. And a lot of these things are from a mentor of ours named Bev Boz, who is now since passed. And she has written many books and used to do these conferences that all of my staff, we would go up to Sacramento or right outside in Roseville and go to her school, and she would teach us all of these things. Yeah. So she was our mentor. That's a Bev Boz thing. Yeah.
Oh, so cool. Well, I mean, because of the things that you're talking about, your staff did have to be trained a little differently than most preschool staff would be trained. Could you talk a little bit about that, and also how we as parents could kind of train ourselves to be like that more with our kids when they're playing, and maybe not jump in so much, not save them so much, not direct them so much?
Sure. So, like I said earlier, was that you first have to kind of go deep with what you value about children, about childhood, and about learning. And so when the teachers and myself left our own formal education, it was very different of what we were taught, and how to be with children was very different than what the patch was offering. So you had to kind of unscramble your brain a little bit. And the minute you went into your heart and we started to talk about our own childhood experiences, our own educational experiences, we knew that we valued something a little differently. And so that's the first place. I went very deep with what I valued, and I studied. I went to Italy. I studied Reggio Emilia, which is a genre of education. I spent a year doing Montessori. I went to a college that was all about, play and what they call emergent education. So I did my homework, and I took kind of like the best of all of those genres, and then really cultivated my own values. And then when the staff all came together, then we would have those conversations about, what does that look like? And the first thing that we did was to first question, why do we say no? Like, why are adults kind of quick to say no? And we knew that what we valued was to have a yes school. We wanted a yes school where if the kids were saying, I want to mix every single color, and we might not understand at all why they need to do that. And was it messy? And was it spending a lot of money on paint? But if they had that idea, we kept saying yes to it. But it always had a caveat, like, what's your idea? And then we always followed up. What did you find out from that experience? Right. So that was the first thing, was to really get us to understand why we say no. Sometimes it came from our own discomfort. Risk management was a really big thing, right? We had this giant tree that just beckoned kids to climb. And some of us would avoid that and say no when kids said, hey, I want to go to the tree, because we were not comfortable yet with knowing how to support a child who might not be ready for that experience. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we said no because we didn't want the mess, or we knew the child's personality, that there would be conflict with another peer. So what we had to really do is deeply examine, how do we use team building So our training did a lot of team building so that we kept each other accountable all the time and that we could bow out or say, I need help on something. So we had a really deep team, and that kind of team building came from a lot of professional development. We always had a retreat every year where we went away for 2 nights and we did all kinds of professional development. I'm trying to think.
I just think one thing I've learned just recently in reading different books is a lot of times you just want to step in, you want to interrupt, you want to say no. You just got to bite your tongue and give them a few seconds to either feel the discomfort of, oh, I'm high in this tree. How am I going to figure this out? Or, just let them basically solve the problem on their own without constantly swooping in and saving the day for them. And I think I was going to ask you also about risky play. I think a lot of parents are afraid of that word. They're afraid of that concept. And I always so appreciated that you guys let the kids have, quote, risky play, because I knew that my kids needed it and I couldn't handle it myself. I was such a worrywart. And so I was like, good, they're going to get it at preschool.
I know, but I'm the same way as the director. There was so much that was on the line, right? We're regulated by a licensing agency from the state, and it's through the Department of Social Services. And so what we knew is that we wanted environments to be safe as necessary, but not safe as possible. And that was a phrase my husband would say, please stop telling families that, because it sounded like we were inviting risk. And in some way, we kind of were. But what we had to do, and that's where the professional development came in, is we had to do our own risk management. So risk is very important for young people because it's important in the workforce and how we ready people for the world. It's important for lifelong curiosity. And we have to provide the practice of developing confidence and risk judgment. And we do this first by accepting that a child's inherent desire for adventure and curiosity is meeting that with a set of balance, right? So the benefit risks, what are those experiences, right? What will they benefit from this risk? So let's go back to the idea of the tree. They would say, I want to go on the tree. And we would never do for a child what we thought they could do for themselves. So we would say, okay. And as they would enter the tree, they would be able to climb it as it was low to the ground. But as it started to get higher, they would put their hand out and they would ask us to hold them. And then we would say, oh, actually, that's your body telling you that you're really not ready for that today. So what do you need to be ready for that today? And then sometimes they would be like, I just want you to hold me. And they would push it and we would be like, no, it's sounding like your body is telling you. And so the first thing is to help children listen to what their body is telling them. That is so important because now you think of a teenager who is at a party, who feels the pressure from a peer to have an experience, that maybe they're not ready for. And if they can start to recognize in early childhood what that feels like, then and how they get out of it and how they can mind map how to get out of it, then they're going to have that skill in adolescence and adulthood and all of the encounters we're going to have as humans later in life. So then what we would say is, do you want to know, how to do that? And then we would give them like a technique, right? About the three parts of your body have to be on the tree at the same time, either 2 hands and 1 foot or 2 feet and 1 hand, and that, you'll do it a little bit more at a time. And we would always be there to spot them, of course. But the thing that happened is, and this is what adults need to do, is we have to go there first. We have to think ourselves, what did that feel like? What do we need? Where are the risks? Where are the benefits? And then we have to do the assessment before the child has the experience. So you kind of have to analyze the benefits for a certain opportunity while also weighing the potential of what can go wrong. And then you're prepared for what can go wrong as well. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. And I think it's incredibly important what you said about kids understanding their own strength and their own limitations and what feels okay and what doesn't feel okay, like when they're a teenager, when they're an adult. And I think also a lot of what they're learning through play, especially with other kids and in different relationships with kids, is I remember you guys saying you have a 2 feet rule. If you don't like what's going on, you have your own 2 feet and you can walk away from the situation. So if some kid is not being nice or freaking out or throwing sand at you, you can't change them. You can take your own feet and walk away from the situation. And I just think if kids are learning that really young, that helps them all through life. Whether do you have an abusive relationship? Do you have a boss that's being toxic?
Totally.
Like
Totally.
if you can learn as a child that you have that option to just get out of the situation, that's just so invaluable. And that's what play gives you.
Absolutely. And if they're doing it under the watchful eye of an adult that's navigating all of those experiences for them, which is very typical in today's culture, then they're not practicing it. So you need to practice it. So in the beginning of the school year, when relationships are forming and the dynamics, there was always like the third guy out, and there was a lot of kids that were really trying to determine their identity and their power, which is very, very common for kids, and it's necessary. And so sometimes what they would do would be like, you can come to my birthday party, but you can't come to my birthday party. You can come into the playhouse right now because you're wearing purple, but you're wearing green. And sometimes we have to we sometimes erroneously vilify that person, and we call them a bully. But really what they're doing is they're trying to test their identity and their power among their peers. And why is so important is that when you empower a child to say, that's not nice, or that hurts my feelings, the nature of the child wants to keep going back to change that person, to welcome them in. And democracy in education and in that social environment is really about empowering the child to recognize that they don't like that they're being demeaned or belittled or excluded, and that the power is actually in them to walk away and to find another wonderful place that's going to gratify them. And that's where the adult comes in. I can see that you're not having a good time here. Let's turn our bodies. Where else could you feel good about yourself right now? And then that disempowers the child now, who now the other child, like the quote unquote, I hate to use the word bully, but then that disempowers the bully because they're saying, excluding that person didn't mean anything to them. They left. And now look at them. They're over there with my favorite teacher, and they're having this really beautiful moment. And now look at that. It didn't work. So they're real, so those experiences, again, only come through play. That is not structured. So could you imagine what you're denying children if you have this agenda of 20 minutes for story time, 15 minutes for outdoor play, 30 minutes to eat. Now everybody has to go to the bathroom and wash their hands. And you are denying them this beautiful, fluid, and flexible opportunity to explore all of these experiences of relationship building, identity making. And it's just so important to their humanness.
And both children learn something, because then the quote unquote bully realizes, when I say you can't come into the playhouse if you're wearing green, and the green person walks away, well, I don't have anyone to play with now. So maybe next time I shouldn't say that.
Right.
And, I know Jonathan Haidt was saying something about sort of the difference between going to like a little league class or team versus just doing like kickball in the neighborhood with your friends. One is very adult led and very structured. One is just very kind of, the kids are in charge. It's very free flow. And that a lot of times kids realize, if I'm a jerk at the kickball in the neighborhood, nobody's going to want to play with me anymore. So you have to really figure out how to just make it
Yep.
work in this little tiny society that you've made.
Yes.
Because as soon as you do something that the society doesn't like, you're not going to be invited back to play. So
That's
let's
right.
figure this out so that the game can
That's
continue.
right. And if we're policing their play, we are healing those like moments of humiliation or moments of exclusivity, because that's right. That's our natural, like we don't want our kids to have those hurtful experiences. But if you look back to your childhood, your parents really weren't there when you were having all and you didn't get picked for the kickball team, or they told you that, like, they didn't like the way you dressed. Right now, we parent police so much that these kids are not building the resilience of knowing how to handle, these kinds of relationships and those tender moments that come with all of our relationships, So, yeah.
Well, and you mentioned empowering these kids. I really, really feel like you and that school empowered parents to know that there's a different way. We don't always have to do exactly what society's telling us, what the school is telling us. And one thing I have really taken is, I feel like a lot of people that find this type of philosophy valuable. A lot of people homeschool. A lot of people do things like Waldorf, but we are in just kind of a typical charter school, public school. But I am so appreciative for a specific example that you have empowered me to understand we don't have to do homework. If you're in grade school, there's a lot of research and evidence saying that this busy work after school is not really doing anything for them. Perhaps it is in older grades, but like it's far more beneficial to just come home after school and play and be outside and whatever. And I remember you're saying that you did that with your own kids. Kind of, why did you do that? How did you get there? And kind of like, what are your thoughts on saying no to homework?
I really, really had a really hard time with sometimes my kids would just be tapped out. When I would pick them up from school, they would be totally done, like emotionally and physically. And I would then say, let's go and get our homework done. And then, we would fight. I mean, that's the truth. It created so much disharmony in our home that I was put in a position that I had to deny what I knew they needed for the expectations of somebody else. And what I knew they needed was to be free of any expectations on them. What is it that you need? And we knew that there were all of these healing properties in nature. So we got our kids outside. My husband was one of those people that came home at 4:00 in the afternoon and put the roller skates on and went on the paseos, and we went swimming, and, like we were big campers. So we really, really, had this view that our time together when formal education began, it took away so much from our family in some ways, right? And we saw our family time was so sacred. And sometimes all we would have would be 3 hours before, together, before it was dinner time and bath time and, getting ready for the next day. So we just started to, really make a claim on, like, this is our time. And sorry, school, you just had them for 7 hours. And this time was very important to us. And I can tell you, it's all in your delivery, right? When you do go to your child's teacher, you explain, to them, this is what my child needs for mental wellness, physical wellness, for still staying connected to the family. I'm not really ready to turn 100% over to the school and the demands of all of these other people, coaches, dance teachers, and the list goes on. So yeah, it was, children need to foster their own idea of pleasure and leisure, and having a good dose of healthy boredom. And I think homework, in my opinion, steals that precious time from them. And now the caveat to that is that if you're saying to your kid, you don't have to do homework when you come home, but now they're sitting in front of a video game or, a movie or, watching television, then we're talking a different,
True.
scenario there. What you need to do is like what I needed to do as a family was to prepare myself for when they came home. So I would free up whatever it is that I was doing in the day. That was done, and I turned myself over because I knew I had 3 hours of quality time with my children. So we would prepare meals together. We would go out together. We would go and visit people. And I'll never forget, there was this one mom who I admired so much. And her kids were like extraordinaire in everything, academics, sports, relationships. They were popular, everything. And one day she opened up the back of her SUV and there were a basket of snacks and a bunch of lap boards, and she was like, we don't get home until 7:00 tonight. So my kids do their homework in the car, they have their snacks, and I go around taking my kids to all of they didn't even, so what they left home, they left school and they got in an SUV and they did not even get home until 7 or 8:00 at night. And she had wonderful nutrition and all of that. But that's when it clicked, like, oh my God, when do these kids think for themselves? When do they examine their own pleasure, their own leisure? What do they do when they're bored? If it's constantly scripted for them, and that they're also in a culture of measurement, right? They're never that means that if they're in all of these extracurricular, which my kids did extracurricular, but they had to choose one thing. And then the other thing that they had to do is they had to stay with it till the end. So they had to really think about whether or not they were ready to give themselves over to a whole season of soccer in 100-degree weather, because we weren't going to bail them out. If you made a commitment, you made a commitment. And then they were one thing that they would sign up for to do. And one of the reasons why is because they started to see we saw the correlation of their self-worth based on whether or not they got the good position on the team or whether or not they got the solo and the dance, recital. And we kind of wanted to limit that too in the early ages, because that really did not identify and represent who they really were. So we wanted to quiet that also a little bit.
Oh, I think there's so much there. I think I have to say that sounds so exhausting to me, going until 7 p.m., not only as the kid, but as the parent, just chauffeuring around. And I fully believe in time to be bored, because that's when the best ideas come. That's when, we all have times when we're bored as adults, and it's a whole other discussion of now, if you're bored, you just grab your phone and look at it. And it's just, whenever my children say they're bored, they know I'm going to say one of two things.
What?
I'm going to say either it's okay to be bored, and you'll get great ideas, or I say, okay, go clean the toilet. Because I'm like,
I'll give you something.
There's a million things around this house that you could do, one of which is cleaning the toilets. And they have actually taken me up on it once or twice. Okay, fine, I'll go clean the toilet. And I was like, okay, great. But it's sort of like, don't you dare say to me that you're bored, because there's a zillion things to do around this house.
Yeah.
And, so that I love the thought of give kids time to give kids time to decompress after the day, because we as adults, everybody's jobs are different, but most people's jobs, they get done and they get done, and they don't actually have to bring it home with them. Some people do, but we're asking these kids to pay attention for 7 hours.
Oh, I know.
And then do a second job after school, do some homework, or do, ballet and soccer and whatever. And I agree with you. We do some stuff like One of my sons does a robotics club, and they both do Cub Scouts. But it is hard in this day and age, because I feel like whenever I meet a new parent, they say, "Okay, what do you guys do?" Like, that's what they want to know. Like, are you guys? What are you in?
Which
are
is
you
the
in soccer?
reason why neighborhoods are absent of children now. I know I'm one of 6 kids, and my mother needed a lot of help at home. And if we stayed at home, we would be washing sheets or making a bed or helping with a meal or like whatever. So we were like, we're out of here. Like, we were those kids that you don't come home until the street lights go on. That saying,
Yeah.
And we live on a half acre here, which, but originally when my kids were in their early formative years, we found a house in this beautiful housing development that had a pool and paseos, and we lived on a cul-de-sac. And my kids would leave the house, and we didn't watch television growing up, but like my kids didn't. And they would leave the house and they would run to the neighbor's home, and they would sit in there and watch television, or they would play video games. And so I remember one day I dropped my kids off at a cooperative preschool, which became the Patch, because that's where my kids went to preschool. So I knew that space was there, but it wasn't being rented. And I would sit at the end of the street and read a newspaper, waiting for my kids to get out, because it was a co-op. So it was only 2 hours, and half the time you had to work there for the other 2 hours. So I would just read the newspaper. And this house went up for sale, and I had that I'm living in now. And the reason is that I needed to also get my kids, because they had access to nature in the backyard. But in this cul-de-sac, no kids went out to play. I was like, where are all of the kids? Everybody was inside with either a video game or watching television, but kids were not even, and they were in extracurricular activities, and I just thought that was like the beginning of a new trend.
And I think it's absolutely continued, and it's gotten worse. And I think we're starting to become aware of that, especially, with The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. He talks a lot about just get out there if you possibly can, and then hopefully other kids will see you being outside, and you'll maybe attract a few more. But I wanted to also say, sort of on the lines of being empowered, not only did you empower me to say, we don't have to do homework. Another thing is we don't have to do standardized tests. That's also an option. And I never would have even thought that was an option had you not said that. And so my son just recently did some testing to see if he qualified for gifted and talented, and it really stressed him out. He did not like taking the test, and he came home really cranky. And so then a couple weeks after that, they told me that there was the standardized test happening. And so I thought, he doesn't want to do that. He's only in 3rd grade. It's not really a big deal. So I opted him out of it. And he ended up, the whole time that they were taking the tests, he got to just sit and read his Harry Potter book. And he was so much happier about it, not stressed out. and that brings me to the thought of, a lot of people these days will say kindergarten is the new 1st grade. Preschool is the new kindergarten. And I talked to administrators that admitted it themselves, and they're like, oh yeah, it's too bad. Things just are getting harder and more, and they just kind of laugh it off. They don't do anything about it. They just realize that this is kind of the world we're living in. And I've even seen ads for preschool prep. So it's like you're constantly, okay, this is getting you ready for this. This is getting you ready for this. It's not all about just who you are now, what stage you're at now, what you need to learn now. It's always preparing. And so I'm curious, I know you had a kindergarten for a little bit. And how was that kindergarten different than the standard kindergarten? And why did you do it that way?
Yeah. Well, it was terrifying because the pressure is really on. And again, there's that beautiful trust word. So we had to really bring the parents who were saying the same thing that you were saying, right? We knew that these parents were saying, my child is really it's not that they're not ready, because it's not about their own development, because no child, just some kids can adapt better to it than others, right? So, so they were very open to say, I really don't want my kids to go into a kindergarten that has this rigor, where they might just get a little lost in that, and we don't know about the advocacy part and all of that, and so. We started our own kindergarten with the understanding that we were going to carry over as much of that passive way of learning as in the preschool years. So we knew that the parents had to first understand that we were learning as the kids were learning, and that we knew that the greatest standard in kindergarten was literacy development. So we sat down and had two amazing teachers, Kat and Ashley, and we had to be like, okay, so if these are the standards, how do we implement these standards in the most authentically play-based way? And so if literacy development really took up 85% of the day, then we just basically knew that we had to kind of create those opportunities for learners through projects that incorporated their engagement. So it would be about games that identified letters, games that kept them moving. There was always a big action and activity piece to it, because they're big body workers, and that shouldn't just stop where they're just sitting in chairs all day long. We had to really recognize they were not ready to be sitting and passively consuming information. They needed to be actively engaging with it. So when it came to snack time, we decided that we were going to do our own meal preps. And in order to do meal preps, you have to weigh and measure. You have to set tables. There was a lot of construction. We had that construction studio, and the language of food studio, and we had the art studio, which were all open-ended. And what we tried to do is to kind of do small group things where the kids had projects, and we always were having them kind of write the instructions. So they would sometimes say it to us, but it would be like, what is it that you made here? And what are the instructions? So the kids were, starting to write, well, number one, what do you want to tell everybody about your project? And then they would be like, number one, can you write down? And then in the beginning of the year, we would write down for them, glue these two pieces together. By mid-year, they were able to either use symbols or some creative writing to be doing that themselves, because they got used to the routine. And it was always attached to a project that they were doing that was not led by the adult. So they were just engaging all of the time with writing and expressing things and doing a lot of storytelling and making books. We did this thing called authors and illustrators, so that the kids were just incorporating, they would start to say to us mid-year, well, how do I say this? And then we would never correct them. They would write the word, draw, and they would spell it the way they phonetically, heard it. So it was always incorrect. We would never correct them. So that kind of inventive spelling, we told the parents straight up, we're not going to correct them. Maybe you don't correct them, because what they were doing was they were marinating in the fact that they were creating words, and it made sense to them. And we wanted them to feel empowered in that. So at the end of the year, there was an understanding that we knew they were up against kids when they went into first grade that had been drilled and skilled all day long. And we just had to tell the parents to be okay with that learning curve, because all of the studies show that by second grade, whether you went, because, kindergarten is still not even mandated in the state of California. So there are kids that don't even go to kindergarten. And some of them don't go to preschool. And even without those experiences, or with the experience of a really deeply play-based preschool, by second grade, if you're not in an academic practice all of those years, they are still learning at the same level by second grade. Wow. Your brain is just more ready to learn that information when you're 7 and 8,
Mm-hmm.
So we have to just take that worry, lens off of our backs, I think, a little bit. And again, trust the kids.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if
Yeah.
that's great advice. I mean, we were stressed, because we really loved our families and they trusted us so much, and we felt really on the hook for making them school ready.
Mm-hmm.
But then mid-year, when we saw the excitement and the desire for the kids, and that they were connecting all of those ideas of what letters sound like and what they look like on paper, we knew they were going to be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some countries, I think, doesn't Denmark not even start school until 7?
Yeah.
So,
My son right now is shopping for a school for my granddaughter, and I really highly suggested Waldorf, because Waldorf, doesn't even teach them how to read until like the second grade. And they do all of this beautiful preparatory work, but not with the rote, I had a patch parent who just came to me the other day and said, this is my third daughter, and my other two kids went to the patch, and she didn't go to the patch, but she now is trying to get into the private school where my two other daughters are in. And the kindergarten, they did the kindergarten assessment, and she couldn't recognize a multitude of sight words at her entering kindergarten assessment. So they told her, sorry, we might not, we'll revisit this over the summer to see if she's ready to come to our private school kindergarten, but
wow.
she might not be able to get in. And the mother was like, but my two other kids are here.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's like, this would be a huge, family disruption for us.
Mm-hmm.
And instead she came to me to say, even though I'm not aligned with this school's value, I really do want all three of my kids to be in the same school.
Right.
So can you help me ready these reading skills to that standard for this summer, but do it playfully? And
But
so I kind of helped her with that. But the real issue was, why are they creating that expectation of that child?
so you're supposed to not only be able to read before kindergarten, but figure out a whole list of sight words pre-kindergarten? It just boggles my mind. I don't
And
understand it.
well, the school, saw that as their ticket to pride, right? Like, this
Yeah.
is now, they could advertise and get tuition from all of these parents who believe that their kids are getting the upper edge,
Right. Yeah. Well, and
and
that's, yeah. It's just, everything is just changing so much. I mean, I think that is an example of like, kindergarten is the new first grade. I mean, that almost sounds like kindergarten being the new second grade. And I mean, how have you seen things change through the last few years in the preschoolers that you were surrounded by, but even now with grandkids? How do you see technology and phones and just all of that changing kids and how they're learning and how they're being raised and how they're just coping with being a kid?
well,
The $1 million question.
oh yeah. I mean, I guess the only word that I could use to describe it is, I feel like it's stealing away a child's youth. The allure is so great, and what it's doing, the dopamine rush of it all, right? From, the visual games that kids are learning on the laptops and the iPads on how to read, is really doing a great disservice. I just saw a study about higher learning institutions reporting that freshmen entering college are unable to read beyond an eighth grade level.
Wow.
And that it's not that they're not cognitively capable of doing it, but that their pleasure place of, where they're not spending time reading a book, and, they don't have the patience for it. And there's no bells and whistles that go
Mm-hmm.
with it, right? And so they are really giving up a lot of their autonomy, really, because, how we access information is all now in a silo, right? We friend our sources to say back to us exactly what we want them to say. So this kind of diverse perspective of information is not happening. And so kids are, really refining at a very early age where their pleasure point is on media, through media. So there's a whole lot that is left unexplored of a child's interests and capabilities and ideas, because that world is actually very small and it's very limiting. So we're seeing like kids not being outdoors, right? And we know all of the outcomes of, they're not connecting to the beauty of nature. So we are losing our future stewards of the earth and the environment. We are seeing kids who are sensory deprived, who are play deprived. We see what it's happening in relationships. I've been retired now for 2 years. I can't even begin to explain how that lack of constant engagement with family and children, how it has limited, my brain capacity. Like I really have to focus. So, we know I'm starting to now study child-centered AI.
Wow.
We're recognizing that this is our future, that I think gone are the days where we have to say that technology is the root of all that is troubling society, because it is here. And so now we need to know how to manage it. And child-centered AI has these really positive things, right, that we think it could bring. We can customize education. We know that humans learn in 12 different ways, and that sometimes schools only cater to a visual and auditory learner. So if you can customize your education to facilitate the way your brain lights up, which AI is claiming to be able to do, and that it will be our future, I see very positive things with that. But what I also recognize about child-centered AI or an AI in general, is that embedded in AI are biases and prejudice and all kinds of, kinks that we might not be working out. And it's a very solo thing. So this whole collective collaborative process, is something I think we really have to work on as AI is coming onto the horizon. It's there's like some things that really worry me, but I think I have to quiet it and trust in humanity. What I would really like to see with technology right now is that now that we know that the makers of big tech, right, Meta, Instagram, all these social media, we now know what toll it took, how it changed behavior, changed living trends and styles, relationships. Now that we know this, right? The cat, like what do they say? The cat's out of the bag.
Cat's out of the bag.
Right. Like you can't put it back in, right?
Yeah. Pandora's box.
So now that we know, I would really love to see a regulatory board that incentivizes positive, healthy technology. And so that what I mean is that, like, like how when you Google, the first thing that comes up is the site that is basically paying the most,
Right.
And so they're not really the best source. It just happens to be accessible as your first source when you're Googling it. Well, I think we need to incentivize these tech makers and these apps they have to subject their app or their program to a multidisciplinary board of regulators that are ethicists and medical workers and behavioral therapists and parents and also tech people and business people. And that they have to, that's the litmus test of how damaging or positive their, program can be to humankind. And if they pass that litmus test, then the incentive is that they get to the number one. We're going to
Okay.
market you to be the number one app for healthcare or for managing, crime or like whatever.
Right.
So I almost feel like I'm trying to hone my own skills now into what that means with technology, because it has changed society so much that
Well, and
we
we're
need to.
all, yeah, we're all the guinea pigs, because I
Yeah,
love your idea, because, sort of the way that we treat food in America also is, let's put it on the market. And if somebody has a problem with it, oh, then we'll take it off the market. Whereas
right.
Europe checks it, makes sure it's safe, and then puts it on the market. We're kind of doing the same with tech. It's like, let's just put it out there. Then we'll figure out what happens. We'll figure out if there's anything wrong with it or bad with it. And then we'll kind of try to put
That's
everything
right.
back into the box afterwards.
And in education, the parents are the ones that have the greatest agency in educational systems. So if we demand certain things, right, then and you just become a very specific delivery in the way we arrive as parents advocating for something for our children. It's all in the delivery. You're always there at board meetings, sitting front and center. You're very censored in how you support or a claim that you might not agree with. You pick your battles very, very carefully, but you're present, and you're showing board members that you are informed, that you are measured in the way you deliver, and that you are their partner. And when these systems start infiltrating into our education system that really are impacting our children, then they bring you to the table. The likelihood of them bringing you to the table to help that, happen, or, so I think we are really the ones with agency. Because if you start bad mouthing a school district or a school and you have power in doing that, that harms them. So they want you to be an ally and not an adversary. So I really think that we just need to kind of create, like, parents with this whole AI thing on the horizon and technology, and Jonathan Haidt saying, we really need these policies that keep cell phones. We need the parents to be driving this and say it is an absolute non-negotiable, or I will take my children somewhere else.
Yeah. And I want everyone to hear you and everyone to understand that parents are the ones with power, because I think a lot of times we feel like we aren't. We just think that, the school has the rules that they have. And again, like we said about the patch, you can take your 2 feet elsewhere if they're not changing and doing what you think is appropriate for your own children.
But we have to be careful of that, because that can also become an elitist statement, because there are families who are saying, like, I am resourced enough to know that I can go here. I can homeschool and give up my career. Some families are even saying, I can go to a private school if this isn't working for me. But there are, we also have to speak for everyone, equity, like what is not good for me and my child is not good for,
true.
Children.
Absolutely. Because I mean, if everybody just starts leaving the schools, that's really not going to solve anything. Like, we have to solve it from the inside. Because, like you're saying, if I don't like it for my kids, then why in the world should other kids be subjected to it just because their parents aren't speaking up?
Yeah. The dismantling of the Department of Education, that's one of the red flags. There might be some wonderful things that can come from this, when you start from scratch again and re-examining what education should look like for all children. But really, where it's raising some really serious red flags is on equity and access to quality programming for everyone. And so that worries me a lot. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. Well, I definitely hope that we can have another conversation, because there's so much here, especially with tech and AI. The last thing that I always ask everybody, because I feel like it is a piece of this entire puzzle of, like, screen less, play more, is this thought of, giving our kids more freedom, giving them more responsibility and agency. And I'm just wondering if you could share a memory that you have, maybe one of your favorite memories or the first one that pops up into your head of when you were a kid and you actually got to do something by yourself. Nobody was around. Nobody was telling you what to do. Whatever that was that you remember of like, oh man, and how old were you and how did it make you feel?
I so remember this. I remember that my grandparents would come and visit and on weekends and they would like leave us like a $5 bill or something. And I discovered the library that summer.
Ooh.
And my mom and dad gave me the permission to ride my bike to the public library. And I was 9 years old. And I would spend the summers there because they had air conditioning. And then my grandparents I would have that $5 bill. And on the corner was a Chinese restaurant. And I would stay and read all day. And then at lunchtime, I would go to the Chinese restaurant and buy an egg roll and then go back to the library and read. And then I would ride my bike home like at 4:00 or whatever time, they told me it was time to go home. But I remember feeling so grown up and so like awakened to the world because you spent your days in the freaking library. So you were reading stories and looking at pictures and, it was life-changing.
Wow. And you got to spend the whole day.
Yeah. In the summertime, I would just go for the whole day. I would get my chores done. I would get on my bike. I would have my little, money in my pocket. And I would go to the library and hang out in the air-conditioned children's library downstairs in the basement.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I love that, we can all think of those things immediately because it was important to us. Like It made a big difference. And
absolutely.
It made us feel like.
And I didn't have a watch. And of course we didn't have phones, but there was a women's college in our town that had this big cathedral with that would ring the bell. And I would hear the 3:30 or the 3:00 or the 3:30 bell. And that's how I knew it was time for me to get ready to go home because I had to be home for 4.
That is so great. I'm so glad they let you do that.
Yeah. And thanks for asking me that. That was a wonderful memory to recall.
Oh, it's fun to hear what everybody says. Well, thank you, Sally, so very, very much. I think this is just a lot of stuff that everybody needs to hear these days and that a lot of parents, I hope that they can hear it and get something out of it. And we can just bring play into our lives as much as possible.
I love that you are doing this and bringing this information and making it dialogue and conversation. And I thank you for your work and for your beautiful boys. I enjoyed having them and miss seeing you. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to Screen Less, Play More, the podcast. A special thanks to Neil Penninger, who composed our theme music. Please join us at screenlessplaymore.com for ideas on how to get your kids outside, away from screens, and enjoying independent play. We also have book reviews, screen-free toy and gift ideas, and so much more.